Yeah, so my name's Paul Foreman. I have a long background in the north of Victoria, and there's grasslands up north of Bendigo, and I run a small consulting business called Blue Devil Consulting. I'm also have links to a group called BioLinks, which is about trying to promote landscape restoration, particularly in central Victoria. And also, I did do a master's and a PhD at La Trobe. Maybe it was the master's day, I think, when I met you, Ben, a while back in the 90s. Yeah, so tonight I'm talking about the grasslands of the Murray Valley Plains, but there's a bit of latitude as I understand it, so forgive me if I vary off that a little bit. I will be talking a little bit about some of the results of my PhD research as well. Okay, we're not moving here for some reason.
Ugh.
I might have to start that again, I think.
Yeah, maybe go out of the slideshow and try starting it again. I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what would have gone wrong.
How's that look? Okay, can you see that okay?
I can see that we've moved on. That looks good to me.
Okay, so I want to cover four things. So I'll just look at types of grassland to sort of contextualize the Northern Plains and the Murray system. The history of grasslands, particularly since European arrival, but also prior. Management strategies that are used for managing grasslands up there, but also elsewhere. And then a bit about the future of grasslands, some of the technologies and sort of opportunities that are out there. And so hopefully there'll be some interesting questions and discussion will come up at the end. So in terms of the context, this is a map just generally of grasslands across the country at a broad scale, and there's three different systems there. There's the semi-arid grasslands up in Queensland, Northern Territory, and sort of zipping into other states as well. That's the sort of light grey. And then there's the dark or the black there, the tropical, subtropical grasslands, which are mainly C4 grasses up in Queensland. Look, there are other ones as well, but these are the sort of main ones. And then there's a group down the bottom, which is the temperate grasslands, although that is a broad categorization, and we'll dip into that in a minute, and we'll see that there's a bit more diversity there than your first meets the eye. Yeah, so drilling down into the southeast, you can see the black areas of the grasslands mapped through the NVIS mapping. And there's areas around the southern tablelands, the river end of New South Wales, northern plains of Victoria, Wimmera, lofty ranges, west of Melbourne on the VVP, and then of course in Gippsland. And so I'll point out there that each of those are sort of affiliated with different bioregions, as you can see, but you also notice there's big sort of gaps between them, which is certainly a characteristic of the mapping as it is to date, but it may or may not reflect reality, as we shall see. This is a list of all the different ecological communities that are listed, and quite a few of them are considered endangered or critically endangered nationally. And the ones I've highlighted there occur in Victoria. So quite a few of the systems I highlighted before are listed under the EPBC Act, so there's certainly plenty of protection on paper. Protection in practice is a different question, of course. Now, just looking at just give you a bit of an overview of the grasslands from the north. This is Terrick Terrick. Some of you might have been there before. It's a really significant area. One of the first of the acquisitions that happened about 30 years ago now up north, as part of the expansion of the reserve system up there. This grassland is particularly significant because quite a large portion has never been cultivated and it has been long grazed, and it's very species rich in places and lots of threatened things. For example, the Swainson pea, Murray Swainson pea, things like Diurus proteina. There's other orchids there as well. Hooded scalyfoot and plains wanderer, which I'm sure you've heard of before. It's one of the most significant birds on the planet, and one that a lot of people are very concerned about and want to see protected through grassland conservation. So this is another one up north. This is further north though. This is the Wanderers Plain area, and it's a reserve that's been acquired by the state some time ago. It's quite a diverse site, but it's very patchy. And you'll notice in this particular shot, there's lots of gaps, lots of bare ground between the different plants, and that's a significant characteristic of some of those sort of semi-arid systems. And here's another shot in that same region showing more wildflowers. So I just wanted to highlight that gappiness, that patchiness that you get in these kind of sites when they're in good condition. They still have plenty of weeds present, but they're much sparser. The other characteristic about these grasslands is they tend to have a lot of salt bushes, which are, at the more inland you go, the more you get, and also lots of annuals are a real characteristic of the better quality sites as well. This is also from Terrick Terrick, but it's a different soil type. And one of the things that's interesting, people drive across the Riverina, for example, and they think it's all pretty boring and flat. But to me, it's actually quite rich and diverse and variable. And one of the things that's really interesting is the soil variation, driven by geomorphic processes and geological processes. And the grey soils are the areas that tend to get a little bit wet from time to time, and they do support different vegetation, often quite dramatically different from areas just immediately joining them, but often still dominated by grasses, but a lot of other wildflowers and things as well. And the wetter they get, the closer they get to what we call seasonal herbaceous wetlands, which occur up north. They tend to have more of the sort of things like triglocan and myriophyllum and aquatic plants, more sedges and the like. But there's often a bit of a blurry line between the wetter grasslands and the seasonal herbaceous wetlands. Another shot here from that same area, lots of billy buttons and early Nancy's, the swampy one, and lots of other stuff that's sort of characteristic of seasonal herbaceous wetlands, which are also rare as hen's teeth. And across to the northeast, some people may not know that grasslands also occur over in the northeast. This is in the Wangaratta area, a place called Borman, which is an old railway reserve. And I did a quadro here quite a few years ago now and got over 100 species in about a 30 by 30 area. So it's one of the most diverse, floristically diverse sites I've ever seen. Full of orchids and geophytes, but also grasses and annuals and other perennial forbs and sedges and rushes as well. Extremely significant site. This is another shot of that same area after it's been burnt. A lot of themata there, of course, which is characteristic of the temperate system rather than semi-arid. And it's regularly burnt, and if it wasn't regularly burnt, it certainly wouldn't be in the condition it is in today. So effectively, this site was historically burnt, as in since Europeans arrived and when the railways were put in, they were burnt regularly for risk management purposes, and then that burning's continued since the railway line was decommissioned. This is another shot near Benalla, another plain or grassland that's gradually deteriorating because of lack of burning and lack of management. And you can see in this case, trees are invading as well, which is another real issue in many areas in the temperate zone. This site has got its population of Diurus punctata, and it's a really significant orchid, of course. And the more this site's neglected, the more chance that that species and many others will disappear. Another site, this is near Murchison, really another significant site with newly described Prussophyllum, stuff like Caesar lilies, heaps of blue devil and geophytes, the various kinds. Really significant area, but very small and requires a lot of regular burning to sort of keep it going. But you know, it's there, and hopefully we can look after it in the future. In the Wimmera, of course, we've got grasslands that are very similar. This is a shot near to the east of Stawell, on the Wimmera, near the Wimmera River, in fact. And then another shot, which is a spiny rice flower population in between sort of patches of bull oak. All of these sites are associated with threatened plants. This is another one, Sclerolena napiformis or turnip vassia, which was, I think, only described in the 80s, and plenty of themata at this site as well. An area on roadside that doesn't get regularly burnt, but probably should. Now, a few years ago, I teamed up with Trust for Nature, or they teamed up with me, I should say, and we put together this brochure, just sort of promoting the plants, and it sort of accompanies a fauna of the Northern Plains. And it sort of goes into a bit of detail about the sort of history and ecology of the system, and then breaks up the vegetation into different life forms. And I mentioned before that one of the characteristics of the semi-arid stuff is the presence of ctenopods, which is the salt bushes, and there's quite a few different genera and species, and also annuals, which are in the best quality sites quite diverse and abundant, and quite uncommon elsewhere. And so that brochure, I think, might be available online through Trust for Nature, and I think you can also get printed off versions from here and there. But drilling into the map there, I did a bit of a division that might have surprised some people. This is Northern Plains, of course, is north of the Divide, and most people think about it as being north of Bendigo, but the Riverina and associated valley bottoms and flood out systems in central Victoria are much more extensive than just the Bendigo region, extending across to the northeast and then down through the river valleys of the Goulburn, Loddon, Avoca, and so on in central Victoria. So most of the grasslands you might be familiar with in the north, like Terrick Terrick, for example, are in that sort of drier end of the spectrum, which I call semi-arid, and all the stuff that's further to the south or east of that green line, which is around the 400 millimetre per annum mark, which is just a bit of a grey fuzzy line really, but it's just illustrative here. Is where you get the more temperate forms, which is dominated by Thermida, has less of the ctenopods, and the annuals don't tend to be present either, and other differences. So this is in the south. This is just to provide a comparison. This is a rice flower site in I think Wing in Western Victoria. Site I've monitored before, and then this is a slightly wetter version, which are in a swale on volcanic country, dominated by POA, but there's also kangaroo grass in there and a few other things, including spiny rice flower. And then, of course, some of the grasslands down there are not dominated by Thermida. They're often just spear grass and wallaby grass, and a lot of other things in there as well. So it's a bit of a mixed picture. And then over in Gippsland, you get a lot of very species-rich sites there, but they do require regular burning. And if you don't do that and look after them, they tend to get pretty rapidly invaded with trees and shrubs, like this site, which is near Terrelgan. Plenty of little patches still left, but gradually being sort of encroached with forest and shrubs in that area. Another site that's interesting too, this is in the Wimmera. This is at Stawell, and it's in the racecourse, and it's an area that would have originally supported trees, probably red gum and yellow gum. And it probably represents an ecological community that's pretty poorly misunderstood and not well mapped, and probably should be listed, I would think, as well. A lot of significant stuff at this site. So that just gives you a bit of an overview of the types of grassland that I'm talking about. I'm trying to sort of paint the picture that it's a diverse story, that the Wimmera, the Northern Country and Central Victoria all have different types, and they are similar but different to the Western District in particular. In terms of the history, you may have seen some old maps. I did a bit of this work as part of my research at La Trobe. It's the Everett map that some of you might have seen from 1869, and it's a bit of an attempt to try and pull together the results of surveys that were being done all across the state at the time as the colony developed in the early days. And it's quite a beautiful map, but it's also quite a broad scale one. But it does give you a bit of an indication of how people were seeing things at the time. And one much later, there was a study done looking mainly from a forest perspective, where this map was produced, forest, non-forest, which is probably not a particularly clear binary, but that's what they did. And so the white areas within Victoria there probably represent some of the larger open plain country that were on that Everett map, just as a bit of an indication. So it gives you a bit of an idea of where they were. But if we drill into the old plans in a bit more detail and have a closer look at them, actually there's even more richness and diversity there than you first think. This plan is for the area just north of Ngambie on the Goulburn River in central Victoria from, I think it's in, 1851. And it's a place called Rayleigh's Plain, which is an area that's considered to probably have been an open landscape with mostly grassland type vegetation. Because in those days, grasslands and pastures, as it were very targeted by pastoralists. So that's why they mapped them. in those early decades. This is the same area, but a later map. This is 1836, and it just shows in more detail. You can see there's annotations with a line, so margin of forest and plain, and then box forest over here. There's also swamps associated with meanders and lagoons with the river. And the next one shows an overlay with the modern imagery. And a couple of things I want to point out here. The Goulburn Valley Highway goes right through the middle of it, and was built in relatively recent times. And I think at the time they didn't appreciate that this area probably was a grassland originally. And also in the red area surrounding the plain, you can see there's a lot of tree cover. It's very fragmented and scattered, but there's quite a lot of tree cover on roadsides and in paddocks. And if you do an analysis and compare the tree cover within the green area, you'll see there's hardly any trees, and the ones that are there are often planted. The other thing about this site that's interesting is the roadsides and some of the small bits of public land still do support remnant grasslands. Sometimes they're in poor condition, sometimes they're better condition. Mostly they've been left as they are. Sometimes they do get burnt or slashed or managed in some way, but mostly not. And so that gives you a further indication that these were real features in the landscape historically. And I also did corroborate these maps with the journals, so independent journal records, so early explorers like Mitchell and George Augustus Robinson, for example, who wandered around this place in the 1830s and 40s. And they made lots of detailed observations, including when they went through forest and open country, again, for the same reason, to try and effectively document the nature of the landscape in the wake, to entice pastoralists to take up the country. And more often than not, the plains were corroborated by those accounts. So I pulled together a big composite map. All those black crosses in there indicate observations from those early explorers. The green represents the pre-1750 EVC coverage as it stands at the moment. And then you've got the dividing range there in red, and you've got the 400mm, which is white line. And the area in grey is my study area based on where I could get plans from the State Library and also the public, what is it? There's another institution that's gone out of my head at the moment that I also got it from. Anyway, the areas in red were the plains or the open grasslands that I picked up that hadn't been, I guess, included in the pre-1750 mapping to date. And there were quite large areas in the northeast and then across central Victoria, around the Loddon and Campaspe, and then over to St Arnaud and into the Wimmera as well. And so these were these gaps, I guess, in between those big blobs of grasslands that we saw earlier. Effectively, there were linkages and connections through them and patches of grasslands through those areas as well. Quite a lot of country covered. So there's long been a debate about the origin of these grasslands. I'm particularly talking about the temperate, the high rainfall ones across Victoria and elsewhere. Historians have been pointing to early accounts and were more or less convinced that they're created by Aboriginal burning practices prior to Europeans, while ecologists have tended to be a bit more, I guess, cautious and have defaulted to climate-edaphic explanations, pointing out that the historic accounts can be a bit ambiguous and they're a bit patchy. So as part of my research work, I developed a sort of a multidisciplinary framework to try and test the idea that treelessness or the grass land distribution is driven by a kind of interaction between what I call bottom up and top down. So bottom up is the climate and the soil, and top down is stuff like herbivory and fire, and that widespread Aboriginal burning, which in the popular sense is referred to as fire stick farming these days, I guess, was likely instrumental in grassland formation and maintenance. And I'm again emphasising temperate as opposed to other types. And in order to do this, I sort of went through a series of hypotheses that I tested, and there was a set of hypotheses in a range of categories. The first one was that natural grasslands exist in unexpected places. So there are grasslands in areas where you'd normally expect to find forest or woodland cover, that the fine scale distribution is linked to fire. So In other words, there were no other sort of plausible explanations for the presence of these sites, or many of these sites, other than fire. And then the last one was that that the fire is at least in part due to, or likely due to, Aboriginal practice prior to Europeans. And I just want to remind you too that back in the early days when Europeans first arrived, Aboriginal people were incredibly populous across the state. This map shows the boundaries of the different tribal groups and language groups, and the numbers represent the clans in each. And then you can see the number of clans often had dozens, if not 50 or more people in each of them. So it was a very populated place. There were a lot of people around doing lots of things to maintain traditional society, including burning practices in various ways. Okay, I just want to drill in a little bit on the northeast. I don't know how I'm going with time-wise, but I'll just forge ahead here. I think I'm doing okay. This is the northeast, so around Shepparton and Wangaratta, and it shows the distribution of these grasslands that I picked up that previously hadn't been. And you'll notice that their pattern isn't random, but it's quite structured around river valleys and often wetlands, with a couple of exceptions. And I did a few analyses in this area. On the left-hand side is the distribution of clay-rich soils. I should say I derived those from very high resolution soil mapping that had been done for agricultural reasons in that region, and it was available across the whole area. And then overlaid that with the grassland coverage, the reconstructed coverage, and you can see that the distribution patterns are very different. And even though the clay-rich soils can explain a proportion, maybe say 10%, the rest of it couldn't be explained that way. And as a result, other explanations point towards fire as being the likely culprit. So moving to management strategies. Now, conservation-based grazing is being used for some time now up in the north. And when Terrick Terrick was first purchased over 30 years ago now, or about 30 years ago, the argument was put that we needed to sort of keep grazing these sites on a conservative basis in order to sort of maintain their quality until we could find out a better way of doing the management. And even though that was a relatively controversial idea at the time, it's become sort of normalised up there today. And I think it's been relatively successful in the sense that the species-rich sites that were there then are still there today, because this biomass management has been carefully managed by Parks Victoria and other organisations over quite some time. Certainly there have been some errors and issues in time, and there are some deficits in terms of research work, and I think that we need to do ahead of us. But by and large, it's been a very successful project in my book. And typically this has happened in areas that have long been grazed, so they're not areas that have never been grazed. They've been grazed for a very long time in many cases, and usually there's been little or no cropping. And so these sites often do support rich flora, including things like, a variety of wildflowers, from annuals to quite large perennial forbs, but also geophytes and the like. And provided the grazing management is appropriate, and that means rotation and resting and appropriate grazing rates and destocking when conditions require it, that you can maintain that composition and diversity. To give you an example of what can happen up there, but also elsewhere, this is in September 2015 when it was quite a dry year. This is a paddock at Terrick Terrick that had been grazed in recent times. And then the following year, we got floods in the spring, and the grass just went bananas. And you get a lot of, like, the native grasses, but also wild oats and a lot of exotic annual grasses like ryegrass and brome grass and so on just go crazy as well. And unless you can address that issue, it will remain very thickly thatched and covered with that biomass for many years afterwards, depending on what the weather does. It doesn't just disappear overnight. In fact, it can take some time to remove. And the golf ball method, some of you might have heard of, would been used for sort of measuring, sort of eyeballing or quickly measuring, quote unquote, biomass or gaps between tussocks. The more balls you can see, the higher the number, and the more open the vegetation is. So this is the other extreme, of course. There's no golf balls in this shot, but it just gives you an idea of what it can be like. There's no space between the tussocks. The exotic grasses are quite abundant, and you can see there's no area there for the wildflowers, the annuals, and so on to persist in between that mass of grass. Some data from one of the sites up here just showing that when you get we got the La Nina event in 2010-11, huge amount of rain, big floods, and the golf ball index just plummeted, went down to very low levels, around I think 6 or so in this case. And then the next slide just shows the same information effectively over a 10-year period, also at Terrick Terrick, based on some work by Mark Antos and others. And it shows that in the 2011 period, we got a massive reduction in the golf ball index, which is high, dense grass. And that lingered for about 3 years and was a complete catastrophe for plains wanderers at that site and other places in the area. And David Baker-Gabb and his colleagues wrote a really terrific paper sort of describing that disaster, as were, and the ecology of a plains wanderer in relation to grassland dynamics up north. And they pointed out that one of the big issues there wasn't so much drought, where overgrazing can occur, but more floods. When you get so much grass, you get overwhelmed and you can't get on top of it, and it can go on for years and snuffs out the habitat for these really critical critters. So it took 3 years to get on top of it after that event. And then again, we had a flood in 2016, as we saw earlier. And that time it was too dense as well, but it didn't take as long for us to get on top of it because I think by that time we'd got a better handle on the grazing management. But I still think, 12 months, 18 months is too long to have that dense grass thicket after a flood. So it's an issue we have to work on. No, so conservation grazing considerations, so disturbance history, biodiversity significance, dynamics, seasonal outlook, stock type and availability. All this stuff has to be considered in doing it. It's not a straightforward process. You've got to source the stock, you've got to control their movements, you've got to document what you do. As I said, floods are harder to manage than droughts. Balancing all the values, flora and fauna and other cultural values, for example. The role of traditional owners and fire, how does that fit in? And in private land, preventing cropping, even though these systems are listed under legislation, they still are in practice not as well protected as you might think. And of course, stock grazing on national parks, is that really something we want to continue doing? Okay, the Derrimut grassland, I just want to make the point here that, and John Morgan and Ian Lunt some time ago did a study at Derrimut, and they documented the changes when a significant grassland was destocked, and I think it was kept destocked and it was replaced with a burning regime. But I think the burning regime, unfortunately, wasn't as good as it could have been, and as a result, there was quite a lot of weed invasion and degradation as a result. And so swapping between a grazing regime history and then going to burning is not necessarily as simple as it seems. Now, the regular removal of biomass is needed, as we all know, to allow light access and create space for diversity and, for wildflowers and the like to thrive, and also check woody plant growth. And you can do that with fire, as we do routinely in many areas and has been done for some time. We can also do it with stock if it's done done well and done appropriately. I should emphasise there is good grazing and there's not good grazing, and that's really critical. And also I've been involved in some projects where we're using sort of based on traditional burning practices to try and reintroduce what would have been the pre-European regime in many areas that haven't been burnt for a very long time. Now, the future of grasslands, to sort of wrap up the talk, I wanted to just make a little bit of a case study of the Northern Plains. So this, back in the day when I first started working up there were very few grasslands in the reserve system. There was only really a handful of sites, and I think less than 1,000 hectares. And there were two main clusters of sites. There's the Wanderers Plain up near Kerrang, and then there's the big Patho Plain north of Bendigo, which is the main sort of area. And then if we switch to, so this is what it was like back then, pre-1977. 1997, sorry. And then today, this is not exactly where it is today, but through a combination of Trust for Nature reserves, Trust for Nature covenants, and bush broker, bush tender type agreements, there's been a lot of acquisitions and a lot of agreements signed, such that there's, I think, around 13,000 hectares that are now variously managed or protected across the region, which is a fantastic step forward from only just a few decades ago. But we still have a little way to go. And this is the Wanderers Plain area. A large portion of that now is either public land or Trust for Nature covenants. And there, some really terrific work that's been done up there. I also said at the moment, though, people are very concerned about a massive wind farm development called Canny Ridge, which is happening right next door, and they're very concerned about impacts on plains wanderers and other fauna in that area. So that's something to keep your eye out for. All right, so lessons from the Northern Plains. So it's a unique system up there, and the biodiversity values have been well documented over the years and got a better sense of what's out there. Over that time, flagship species like plains wanderers have been well and truly sent front and centre for the focus of our on-ground work, but also marketing and promotion work. The grasslands up there, the Murray Valley grasslands, have been listed under the EPBC Act. We set up a technical advisory group many years ago. It's no longer functioning, but it did go for 10 years or so and produced a strategic plan, which really sort of helped to set out the big parameters of where we thought we were going up that way. Community ownership and engagement, Friends of Terrick Terrick, and also the Northern Plains CMN, now called the Northern Plains Conservation Alliance. Multiple ongoing land acquisition and permit protection, which I mentioned, and some market instruments are emerging. And there's a critical need for pragmatic biomass management. So in other words, we shouldn't get too caught up with what we think might have happened historically or ideological positions. We just need to be pragmatic about getting biomass managed, because if we don't, we will get negative results. At least that's the case at the moment. And also, I think a consistent and collaborative effort over many years has led to really significant progress and results up there. There's still huge challenges and there's still much to do, but I really think it's something that we should be celebrating as quite a successful program. So new survey methods. These days, song meters are now used routinely instead of spotlights, and four-wheel drives for monitoring plains wanderers, and also infrared cameras. And I think the combination of that has revolutionised our thinking about what's going on with those birds, so that there's a lot more scope to do more with that, which is fantastic. There's also technologies like the grassy ground cover type work, where you basically scalp off a degraded landscape and throw out huge amounts of diverse seeds and get the recovery within a short space of time of quite a rich grassland. That technique works well, but it is expensive. Another example of that is a Euroa Arboretum. The first one was in the Western District, and this one's up in Euroa. It's also a terrific site if you want to go and check it out. It's at the Arboretum. And as I said, it depends on mass seed production, and that these days in Australia is still a small industry and still quite expensive. And unfortunately, that technique is extremely expensive to roll out on any scale. Rewilding is another one, where you take a site that's already in good condition and you add to it. And plants are a straightforward one. This is an example of hoary sunray up at Korak on the Wanderers Plain in the north, where some people have thrown out some seed in the past, and you've got quite a nice population of a plant that was sort of almost extinct in Victoria. So it's quite easy to do, and it makes a lot of sense to keep doing it and rolling it out on a bigger scale. And also I've been involved in a project up near Donald, where a farmer is interested in improving his paddock, which is partly not being cultivated for sheep and wool fleece production, at the same time boost biodiversity. So we're trying to use a combination of grazing and burning plus seed introduction to try and improve from both a pastoral and a biodiversity perspective. That project's really only just started, and I'd love to be able to do more of that. It's just a something that's going to require a bit more investment and research effort in the future. Hopefully we'll be able to do that. And this site, incidentally, does have some significant populations of chariot wheels and Murray Swenson pea, which are both listed as nationally significant, and plains wanderers have been recorded there historically. Yeah, so just a couple other points to make before I finish. This is some data just showing the dynamics of grassland in the context of the climate, but also biomass reduction at Terrick Terrick. The red line just shows the substantive dynamic over 10 years or so. And the green line is a hypothetical line where I've effectively removed the exotic element, so the annual grasses. And it just shows you what big of an impact you can have on that dynamic curve when you remove that element in the equation. And you can do that relatively easy using frequent fire. Look, I won't go into the details of how you might do it, but it is theoretically possible to do that, and I'd love to be able to pursue that on a bigger scale. And really the objective in the north is, and it probably is elsewhere, is to try and get a system back in more balance. With the grass domination, both natives and exotics, it's a highly dynamic system, and it's very vulnerable to the ups and downs with climate. But if we can make it more stable by introducing a diversity of life forms, which we think reflects the historic state, so a lot more wildflowers, for example, then we think it will be a lot less dynamic and a lot easier to manage and more biodiverse and just in a better state. And I'll skip over that one. And just a point about technology, remote sensing is becoming more and more available these days and more sophisticated, and the resolution is changing, and there's lots of other, really good things happening in that area. But I just want to make the point that the old MODIS pixels, which used to be very broad scale, are now being superseded by Landsat and now Sentinel, which are increasingly fine resolution. And from that, you can generate, and they usually come through every few days, if not every week. And that's freely available often. And you can generate some terrific, maps and graphs for your particular site or parts of your site and get a bit of a handle on what's going on with biomass dynamics. This is a few examples of the NDVI, which is greenness, and there's other metrics linked to that for different systems across the country. And it just shows you that you can effectively document what's going on with greenness dynamics at your site, and then you can then manipulate it through grazing, through burning and other practices, and then use remote sensing as a form of documenting improvements over time. So this is just a very coarse state and transition model for the Northern Plains, and it just shows the green boxes represent grasslands in a better state, in a higher quality state, and the red ones are in a degraded state, if not removed. And the idea is to try and take sites that have been degraded and improve their condition over time. And in the case of plains wanderers, strategically doing that, say, around existing paddocks or known high quality habitat, can be critical in expanding the scope for them in the future. And so you can take sites that have been cropped historically, and with time and with tech interventions like appropriate grazing and burning, you can potentially convert them into these higher quality sites over time, and then expand and build the quality of habitat for that species and others. Rewilding is something that's well underway. The zoo's involved in programs with plains wanderer breeding, and also the recently rediscovered earless dragon in Western Victoria, as well as through a zoo program, and other organisations have been involved with mammal breeding and reintroduction programs, usually within fenced areas that are predator proof. But in the future, we might be able to do more in that space as well. I think some exciting prospects there. So in conclusion, just wanted to make a few points. Lowland grasslands were originally widespread and diverse across the state, temperate, semi-arid and coastal, and research shows that the grasslands were even more extensive than we first understood based on the 1750 modelling. These areas were targeted naturally by Europeans for pastoralism and later intensive agriculture, and many communities, ecological communities, are now extremely scattered and fragmented. on public and private land, and most are listed under the EPBC Act. There's been a long debate between historians and ecologists around the origin, and the evidence points to a significant role for Aboriginal burning. I think something that's been underplayed, especially from an ecological perspective, for some time. There's a clear current role for fire in the Western District, as we know, and elsewhere, and biomass is critical for maintaining health, and grazing can play a role, even though it is a bit contested in some regards. So both fire and stock can play a role, and they have been used successfully, even though there are challenges that we need to overcome, that we need to invest in resolving. So the future for grassland is challenging, but there are successful models and strategies and technologies out there that we really could use to build a promising future. Just a question of getting on and doing it. And there's an urgent need to scale up these protections, improve condition with some smart interventions and restoration, and some other reforms. And especially for temperate grasslands, the research points that, that human agency is probably really critical from the past in terms of Aboriginal burning. And in the future, there's no doubt human agency continues to be critical for grasslands. So it's a very special ecosystem or set of ecosystems, and humans have been involved one way or another for a very long time, and we need to continue to maintain that leadership and visionary role. So thanks very much for listening. Hopefully some good questions.
Thanks, Paul. That was a very widespread, wide-ranging look at a lot of grasslands and a lot of issues there. So I guess we're open for questions. If anyone's got their thoughts together enough to ask one yet, welcome to put it in the chat or to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Oh, I hope it wasn't too broad in its scope, Ben. I was trying to sort of focus a fair bit on the Northern Plains, but I can't help but wander sort of beyond there from time to time.
I might just kick off to get while everyone else is thinking, Paul. So you're talking about both grazing and fire as potential tools, sometimes maybe in combination, from what I could gather. And so on sites I've managed, I've found that grazing, whether it by rabbits, roos, well, rabbits or roos in my case, but potentially livestock, if you have that after a fire, it can be actually mean that things don't really recover from the fire. So I guess, what are some of the issues you have to balance when you're using both of those?
Well, I should emphasise that grazing is stock grazing, and particularly sheep, but it also can be cattle. And in the case of rabbits and kangaroos, basically they're not directly controllable as a manager. Like, it's not as if you can open the gate and stick all the rabbits and kangaroos in there or take them out whenever is convenient. So you need to be able to control the total grazing pressure. So I would argue that unless you're on top of kangaroos and rabbits, there's nearly no point in using stock grazing until you do that. And when you do a burn, I agree, yes, in those early days, in those early weeks and months, it's very palatable and very attractive to grazers, and it's usually not the best idea to put stock in at that point unless there's a particular reason to do so. So usually the burning follows, or immediately follow burning, you have resting before you would put stock in there for a particular reason. So it just really does depend on exactly how you structure the regime, and it really is critical how you do it, even though it might sound like it's just grazing. Not all grazing is the same, and you need to have control. You need to be able to turn it off and turn it on when it's appropriate ecologically. And if you don't have control of the grazers, then you won't be able to do that. John, you got a question? John Del Pratt?
Yeah. Hi, Paul. Long time.
Yeah.
Paul, are you finding particular exotic species are following the fire as well? Are you having problem with exotic species which like the fire?
Yeah, look, there's one particular group, and that's the Iridaceae, the onion grass and the thread iris, those sort of things.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure whether they are enhanced by burning or whether they're just exposed by burning because you remove the rest of the biomass. But they certainly aren't reduced by burning. So one of the things that I think I'd love to be able to work on is maybe some herbicide technology or something else, some other control method to try and address that particular group of plants. Having said that, they aren't necessarily ecologically all that competitive in those systems, so they may or may not be a worry, depending on where you are. I think up north, maybe not, but maybe elsewhere they might be.
I think I was probably thinking more about the smothering sort of grass species or perhaps shrub or tree species that might, and forget the tree, I didn't mean that, but the grasses, if you've got a particularly problematic grass.
Yeah.
And also from your experience of the cooler southern grasslands, have you got any comment on fire and species that might follow that?
I don't really. I know that quite a few of those, things like African lovegrass and serrated tussock and Chilean needlegrass and most of those will not respond particularly positively, like as in being reduced by burning. They might even be encouraged in some cases. So there's no real silver bullet for many of those invasive perennial tussock grasses, unfortunately. So I don't really have any magic bullets for that. There may be someone else in the audience here who has more experience and knows how to do it, apart from just the usual sort of herbicide, the fairly tedious spot spraying and knocking it out bit by bit that way.
In our restorations, I mean, the big question in my mind, I'm not going to have a chance to solve it, I don't think, but is just to what extent we can manage these restored grasslands. And I'm talking about the scalp technique here, but these restored grasslands that either have weedy grasses introduced in the seed or are later invaded. I think mainly it comes in the seed. To what extent we can live with those and manage them, and to what extent we have to eradicate them. And it's just an open question, and it's an important one though, because we spend a lot of time identifying particular grass species which we want to remove, but then that of course is a very tedious process and not necessarily very productive. And I don't know to what extent we can actually live with them through management. But anyway, that's just an open question.
Yeah, look, it's a whole area of discussion.
Could I just butt in for a second? Can you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, sorry.
Much better.
There you go.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Continue.
Any other questions?
So we have one from the comments from Alison Tees. The effect of pastoral activities, CF, to effect of gold mining on grasslands. So are you aware of areas that have been subject to historical gold mining that were grasslands?
Yeah, I think I know Alison. I know Alison's situation, and then I know that I think it's the Tullarook Creek where there was a gold mine further upstream that sent sludge downstream. You might have heard of the famous stories of sludge coming down from Bendigo into the Northern Plains in the 1850s and 60s. Well, that happened elsewhere and was quite a widespread phenomenon. So there are plenty of examples where sludge just buried, valley bottoms and the flanks of valleys, and including grasslands. So I suppose you could say that gold mining affected grasslands that way. So in that case, it would have been rather catastrophic, I would have thought. But otherwise, I can't think of any other ways that gold mining was directly involved.
All right.
Debbie.
Yeah, hi, Paul.
How you going?
Good. I just want a question about you saying if we've got really degraded grasslands, you're saying if we just burn them, they'll just come good again. I'm sort of just wondering about the herbs, because if you haven't got seed left, how are they coming back? Are you saying we need to put seed? Like, what do we do?
Oh, no, I did say, Debbie, because that example I mentioned at Donald, that needs seed reintroduced as well. There are some species that are already there in good numbers, and they won't be impacted. In fact, they might even be benefited by burning, and there are others that need to be encouraged or put back. So the burning is just one part of a regime of management, and it's just one tool that helps you to sort of reduce the competition from particularly exotic annuals in that context. But it's only one aspect of the restoration process. You need to do other things as well, and you also need to do the burning regime over time. So just one burn, for example, is probably not going to be that effective.
Absolutely. I just want another question. Where's Boreman Rail Reserve? Sounded really interesting. I'd like to see it.
It's north of Wangaratta. You just drive north of Wangaratta towards Boreman.
Boreman. Okay. I
Yeah,
wrote it down. Hope I got the right spelling.
Yeah, it's you just go up there in spring. I think this year should be a pretty reasonable year. It just depends on whether it's been burnt recently and yeah, where it's at in that regard.
Thank you.
So we have another question from comments. Mark Freestone. Great talk, Paul. Thoughts on how to recover degraded grasslands with high soil nutrient loads from past fertilizer use, e.g. that support dominance of exotic grasses? And is this a big problem up in the northern grasslands? That's an addition from me, Ben.
Yeah, it is. It depends on, yeah, like, so the sites that I like to work on are often less degraded and they've got more scope to sort of improve with the kind of interventions I've been talking about. But I did mention the grassy ground cover one, and I know John Morgan is here as well. He's been involved in doing that sort of stuff, I believe, elsewhere. And that technique works really well. It's just that it's expensive. Basically, what you do is you take a site that's just super degraded and highly nutrient rich, and you scalp off the top 5 centimeters or so and remove a lot of that seed and a lot of that nutrient load, and then effectively start again with a new suite of species. That technique seems to work very well, but as I said before, it's quite expensive and intensive, and probably only suits particular situations at this point. Maybe in time, if the cost of those things comes down, it might be something that we could do on a more widespread basis. I know they do that sort of thing in other parts of the world where they've got cheaper seed, but not here, unfortunately.
Okay, so Jerry Ho has asked us another follow-on question. I'm wondering about the nutrient load imposed by controlled grazing. In the grassy woodland EVC around Epping, the profusion of perennial grassy weeds, e.g. Phalaris aquatica, was blamed on animal husbandry changing soil stoichiometry.
Yeah. Look, I'm not saying that grazing's been some squeaky clean history. It's been catastrophic in many ways because it's been managed for other reasons, and I'm talking about using grazing for conservation purposes. And one of the aspects of the grazing that you do up north is they have fairly strict quarantine methods, so removing the contents of guts from sheep or having the fleeces removed before they go onto sites, for example, can help to reduce the amount of contamination coming in. But a lot of these issues that you're talking about, Jerry, are probably legacy issues from past mismanagement and so on and so forth. So effectively cleaning up a mess from the past. And also, I suppose Phalaris is a big issue in higher rainfall areas in the southern areas. So it probably is a more tougher adversary in those areas. And so the sort of techniques I'm talking about here may not be all that useful for that species.
Thanks. David Unwin, you've got your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yep, sure. Hello, thank you, Paul, for that talk.
Hi, David.
I'm in central Victoria, so just sort of on that bridge between the volcanic plains and the sort of the temperate plains that you're talking about.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions. So you're talking about the different soil types that you've got going on in the northern plains. I was wondering what sort of soil types they are. Are they sedimentary or sandy or?
Well, they're all part of a vast alluvial plain or higher level riverine plain, and they're very complex geomorphology linked to what they call paleo channels or prior streams. We had creeks and rivers even going through their systems and depositing complex patterns of sand dunes and swales, levees, and then sort of outer floodplains, and then you have minor depressions, and there's huge amounts of variation in clay composition across that spectrum, and also inundation vulnerability to inundation. And they're often the key things that sort of control that patterning I'm talking about. And you often get very small changes in elevation, like it might be a matter of tens of centimetres, and you'll get a different soil type because of those reasons, and they will support different vegetation. And sometimes there's dramatically between woodlands, wetlands and grasslands within metres.
Right. Okay.
So it's all linked to that.
Second question I've got is there a bit of a roadmap or an instruction book of how to go about restoring grasslands? So I'm in a land care group, and I've got a few areas in mind that I've seen some pretty good stuff that's still there, but we don't manage it very well. And so I'm just trying to figure out how I can have more influence and get more done. So if there's a book that helps me know what I need to do at what point in time, starting with burning and then moving to something else.
Well, yeah, look, there are some booklets around. I think Ben might be able to refer some straight away that have been published over the years. So there certainly are some good ones. But I guess the issue with that is that they give you great context and often, general advice, but it's very difficult to be prescriptive for a particular site. And so you can probably get a sense of what you should do or you might need to do for your site based on reading those books, but it may or may not be right. So it probably would help to get a little bit of particular advice for your site, which you should be able to get through, contacting people or talking to, people on the phone like myself or John Del Pratt or John Morgan and others that might know the sites.
Great, thank you.
So if I can just...
Ben was holding up sweeping plains there.
Yeah.
Good on
If
you, mate.
anyone could see my video, I'm holding up a book which is out of print in hard copy, but available from CSIRO as a PDF that you can buy online, which is a pretty good starting point and the best in-print starting point we've got for managing grasslands. It's called Land of Sweeping Plains. So if you go to CSIRO Publishing and look for this, it won't answer all your questions. Every site is different, as Paul said, but, it's a good fuel for thought, and then you can go and find some experts and experienced people who might help you some more after you've had a look at something like this, I would suggest.
It's also
Thanks,
now 10
John.
years old, so it needs an update. We do need to update. But yeah, it's a good place to start, David, I think. It makes a good doorstop too in the summer.
John, are you asking another question or just popping in on that one? No. Okay. So we've got a question
also,
from...
I just say that Kath Rawlings is about to publish something too.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Hello, Kath.
Alana Kingston has asked us, I've been observing a paddock that has historically been used for grazing and cropping, but I've stopped that for a few years. I've noticed native grasses coming back around the eucalyptus paddock trees. We otherwise have phalaris dominating, which is obviously perennial. I'm wondering for grassy woodland areas if plantings of trees or pioneer shrubs might work in some way as a passive, slow way to encourage native grasses over exotics.
Interesting question. I've sort of heard that before. I personally don't really advocate putting quite dense tree cover in sites, because what it tends to do is just outcompete everything on the ground, whether it be natives or exotics. And in the worst scenario where you have a very dense tree planting, you can almost eliminate the ground layer. It just becomes leaf litter. I don't know. I tend to try and work from the bottom up, from the soil up. So I like to encourage improving the ground layer first, and then over time you can start introducing shrubs and trees and build up from there. And usually if trees are there, it's harder for you to do things like patch burning and patch spraying or even grazing, which may be useful to improve the ground layer that you're talking about, Alana. Yeah, look, it's going to be horses for courses. I'd probably need to have a look at it to really give you some direct advice.
Do we have any further questions? Just checking, nothing on the chat.
Just related to that last question, those trees that do create that sort of halo and give you a bit of a drying out, and I guess that suppresses the phalaris to some extent. It is a great source for propagules too. You've got an opportunity there to do some collection and grow some plants yourself and build up your seed stock, and then if you can work out from those halos, then that's small incremental improvements.
Debbie has another question. Do you want to unmute
Yeah.
and ask?
I am unmuted. I just want
Okay.
to ask Paul, the information you gave us tonight, is it available? Is it published? Is it got an article or something? Because that, it was a lot and it was very interesting, and I probably need to read it and look at it a lot more.
Yeah, some of it is.
Yeah.
Some of it's in some of the papers that I published in my PhD process, but also the PhD as well. There's some stuff that's not published. I did start doing something with John Morgan a few years ago around the stability of grasslands using the Terrick Terrick data, but that hasn't come out the other end at this point. So maybe one day it will. So
definitely the things about where the grasslands are and, approximately and why. And I mean, I certainly think that's extremely important and valid and interesting, and very aware that they were maintained, obviously, for clans and people to eat. They were food bowls, which people don't really understand, I don't think. So fascinating. And I think really would be lovely to see that somewhere. So we could look at it, everyone else can sort of go, well, is there still grasslands there? Maybe there is.
Yeah, well, as I said, I've got all the content from my research in the PhD thesis, which you can download from La Trobe Library if you want it.
Was it free?
I don't think you have to pay for it, from what I understand. So just Google it, I think. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And Sally Mann, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Sally.
I just wanted to ask, is grazing ever better than burning? Are we generally recommending grazing because it's a broad-scale land management tool that works for land managers who are graziers? Or are we recommending it because there are things that grazing can do that burning doesn't do?
It's a good question. All the sites over your way, Sally, as they're small sites and they've never been grazed, or probably haven't been grazed much in the past, and they should be burnt regularly, as you do and others do, and should continue that. The only place where I'd advocate grazing is where sites have been grazed for a long time, typically, and B, where there's such a scale involved that burning would be impractical or really super expensive to do. So it's really just a question of the pragmatics of reducing biomass in the appropriate way in a particular scale. And grazing lends itself in particular situations, but I don't want to get people to get the impression from this that I'm suggesting grazing is applicable everywhere all the time. On the contrary, it is a very particular regime that needs to be very carefully applied in certain situations and then managed carefully as well.
Yep, great. Thanks, Paul.
It looks like we might be winding up. Are we all out of questions? Thanks a lot, Paul.
No worries.
Yeah, you could look up Paul's publications if you look at academic papers and get more information, or look up Land of Grassy Plains for the most recent book scale publication on these issues. And look, we will always welcome people with extra questions to get in touch with the Grassy Plains Network. And if we don't know the answer, we'll certainly try and pass you on to someone who does.
No worries.
I guess, yeah. If anyone wants to stick around, the regular Grassy Plains Network meeting will follow, but we'll have a 10-minute break. So, any last words, Paul? Is that
No, thanks very much for the invitation, and yeah, feel free to contact me if you have any specific questions, or as I suggested before, if you want to look at my thesis at the Latrobe Library, just look. You should be able to download it from there and have a look at the relevant bits if that's your interest. But feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to talk about specifics.
Thank you.